You ever had your $300,000 combine towed in the middle of harvest season because some HOA Karen thought it was too ugly for the neighborhood view? Yeah. That happened. And she had no idea that not only was that land outside her jurisdiction, it was actually leased to the state. And I'm the one leasing it. So when she yanked my tractor, she didn't just mess with a farmer. She messed with a federal operation. But let's rewind a bit to where this all began, right between the cornrows and Karen's high horse. See, I've lived on the edge of this little HOA slice of suburbia for almost a decade now. My property borders their community, and for the most part, we've kept our distance. I do my farming, they do their backyard barbecues and gossip circles. Peaceful coexistence. Or at least it was, until Karen got elected HOA president. And once she got that taste of power, it was like watching a toddler with a taser, pointing it in every direction, seeing what would spark. First it was noise complaints about the roosters, then it was my grain silos being an aesthetic blight. But the real war started during harvest. That season, I had just started working my north field, 160 acres of state-leased cropland that wraps like a horseshoe around the HOA's backyard. That field isn't just for my own use. It's part of a contract I hold with the state agricultural department for strategic food production. So when harvest hits, it's go time, no delays, no excuses. I was out there at sunrise, piloting my combine, humming along to Johnny Cash with the cabin windows cracked open. I remember thinking, maybe this year Karen will just let it go. She didn't. By the second day, she was out at the edge of the property line with her arms crossed and her little clipboard, looking like she was preparing to invade Normandy. I pulled over the tractor, stepped out, and waved. She didn't wave back. Instead, she shouted across the hedgerow that I was in violation of communal peace standards, and that my equipment was causing a disruptive visual experience. Visual experience. I almost choked on my coffee. I told her, as I had multiple times before, that the land wasn't HOA property. It was classified farmland, leased by the state, and governed by county and federal AG laws. She wasn't having it. It's within our visual domain, she snapped, as if that gave her magical legal powers. You're bringing down property values. You're looking at a tractor, not the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, I said, trying to keep things light. She didn't laugh. That night, I locked up the equipment as usual and headed to the house, figuring she'd just complain to her board, maybe draft another passive-aggressive flyer, and call it a day. I even joked about it with my neighbor Dave, who lives just inside the HOA and secretly hates every meeting he's ever attended. But when I came back the next morning, my tractor was gone. Gone. Not moved. Not blocked. Gone. The gravel path where I parked it was empty, and the only tracks were tire marks leading out to the service road. At first, I thought maybe the state had rerouted it for inspection, but they would have called me. Checked my phone, no missed calls. Then I saw the little paper taped to the side of the barn. Towed, abandoned machinery reported by HOA safety oversight. I laughed. Out loud. I genuinely thought it was a prank. But then the realization hit me like a 2x4. She'd actually done it. Karen, the queen of petty, had called some backwoods towing company and convinced them to haul off a 12-ton combine during a scheduled state harvest window. I stood there, stunned, trying to calculate how someone could be that bold and that ignorant at the same time. And then I smiled. See, Karen didn't just interfere with my personal equipment. That tractor? It was listed on an active state agriculture operation. Towing it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a federal offense. Tampering with a state-leased harvest vehicle in an active window triggers a full investigation by the AG department. Which means I now had a state inspector, a sheriff's deputy, and a transportation compliance officer all interested in why some suburban HOA had decided to commandeer a $300,000 machine without authorization. By noon, they were on site. Karen was, too, marching over in her neon-orange windbreaker like she was leading a parade. She had no idea the man with the clipboard wasn't there to inspect my tractor. He was there to investigate her actions. "Ma'am, can you explain why you instructed a third-party tow service to remove state-contracted equipment from active agricultural property?" the inspector asked. Karen blinked, then puffed herself up. "It was parked near our community line. We deemed it a nuisance. It was within visual range." "I'm sorry," the inspector said, not even hiding his smirk. "Visual range is not legal jurisdiction." Karen tried to interrupt, but he raised a hand. "You're aware, of course, that this land is leased to the State Agricultural Authority and falls under protected infrastructure designation during operational windows?" She looked like someone had just slapped her with a clipboard. "You what?" "Yeah," I said, stepping forward. "I lease the whole strip around your neighborhood. All 160 acres. I've been under contract with the state for 6 years. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. I could almost hear the gears grinding in her head as the inspector continued documenting everything. Her face flushed red, then purple, then a color I don't think has a name. And that's when it hit her. She hadn't just made a nuisance call. She'd committed a felony. She tried to backtrack, stammering that it must have been a miscommunication, that she didn't know the rules, that someone else from the board approved it. But the inspector was already calling it in. The tow company would be fined. Karen might be liable for the retrieval cost. And worst of all, for her, anyway, it was all going in an official report. That report would be shared with both the HOA's legal team and the state attorney's office. Karen had stepped out of her little manicured kingdom and onto a battlefield she didn't even know existed. And me? I didn't have to lift a finger. Because now the state was handling everything. But trust me, that was just the beginning. Karen had made a serious mistake, but the real fun didn't start until the state inspector returned 2 days later, with backup. That morning, I was out checking the irrigation lines when I saw 2 white SUVs crawling down the service path like they were casing the place. One had the state seal plastered on the side, the other just had government plates. Out stepped the same agricultural compliance officer from before, along with someone new, tall, suited, and carrying a briefcase that looked like it had ruined more careers than it had saved. I walked over, wiping dirt from my hands, and nodded. They introduced themselves again, and the new guy flashed a badge. Not a sheriff, not a cop. He was with the state's Department of Infrastructure Integrity. Yeah, that's a thing. Apparently, when you lease farmland to the state for strategic harvest under emergency preparedness clauses, you get all sorts of protective coverage. That tractor? It wasn't just a machine to them. It was classified under essential agricultural infrastructure. Meaning Karen's tow stunt had escalated from petty theft to potential disruption of critical supply chain asset. The agent handed me a folder, copies of official notices, a preliminary incident report, and an official property line survey that highlighted in flaming red just how far outside the HOA's jurisdiction the tractor had been parked. Then came the kicker. A printed copy of a community-wide email Karen had sent out the morning after the tow. She bragged about her decisive action to protect the neighborhood from what she called unsightly machinery encroaching on our family space. She even included a photo of the tractor being lifted by the tow truck like it was some heroic victory shot. I could barely keep a straight face reading it. "Where did you get this?" I asked, though I already had a pretty good idea. The agent smirked and said, "Anonymous submission from one of the HOA members. We've received 7 so far." Karen was making enemies faster than I could harvest corn. And now the state had her words, her admission of interference, and her assumption of jurisdiction where none existed. It was a golden platter of liability. I offered to walk them down to the field boundary, show them where the combine had been parked. They took photos, measurements, and confirmed GPS coordinate. It wasn't even close. The tractor had been parked 74 feet from the HOA line, well within the state's operational zone. While we stood there chatting, Karen showed up, marching down the access path in that same orange windbreaker, arms flailing like a crossing guard on caffeine. She hadn't seen the SUVs until she was 10 feet from us. Her face dropped when she spotted the state badges. "What's going on here?" she snapped, glaring at the agent like she was about to put him in detention. The agent turned slowly and held up his ID. "We're investigating a report of interference with state-managed agricultural operations. You must be Karen." She bristled. "President Karen. HOA president." He didn't even blink. "Great. Then you'll want to be very careful about what you say next." She laughed, that short, barking Karen laugh like she just heard a toddler challenge her to a duel. "You people are overreacting. It's a tractor. It was abandoned. We had every right." The agent didn't even look at me. He just opened the folder and handed her a copy of the email she sent. Karen's face went through every color in the emotional rainbow. Confusion, realization, defiance, and finally, that cold flash of panic when someone realizes they just handed the authorities a written confession. She clutched the paper like she could will it out of existence. "That was a private community memo," she barked. "It was sent to over 60 households and forwarded to state investigators," the agent replied calmly. "That makes it very admissible." She spun toward me, jabbing a finger. "This is your fault. You baited us by leaving your equipment there." I shrugged. "On my land? During scheduled state operations? Yeah. Totally devious of me." The other agent, the one in the suit, stepped forward. "Ms. Karen, we're formally notifying you that your actions have triggered a Level 2 investigation under Section 4B of the Agricultural Infrastructure Protection Act. Depending on our findings, you may be facing fines, liability for operational losses, and possible criminal charges for unauthorized tampering." Karen looked like someone had slapped her with a shovel. She opened her mouth, then shut it again. Twice. Her clipboard slipped from under her arm and hit the gravel with a pathetic little clack. "We'll be in contact soon," the agent added, motioning for his team to follow him back to the SUVs. Karen just stood there, breathing heavy, like the whole world had gone sideways and she couldn't find her footing. I tipped my hat to her as I turned away and went back to checking my irrigation line. That afternoon, I got a call from my contact at the agricultural department. He'd reviewed the footage from the combine's dashcam, which I had totally forgotten was even there. Turns out, not only did it record the tow, it caught Karen standing beside the truck, pointing where to hook the chains, posing for photos and saying the words, "This'll show him who runs this neighborhood." I laughed so hard I had to sit down. It was like watching a cartoon villain narrate her own downfall. I uploaded the footage to the state server, and they told me it sealed the case for interference. But there was more. They had pulled records on the tow company Karen used. Turns out, it wasn't even a licensed contractor for heavy agricultural equipment. She had called in some cousin-run repo outfit that specialized in towing beat-up sedans from parking lot. They had no clearance, no permits, and no insurance to haul a state-registered vehicle. Which meant the state was now looking at Karen not just for interference, but for orchestrating an illegal recovery. And if you think Karen was panicking before, you should have seen her the next day when the sheriff showed up at her doorstep with an official citation and a request for a formal statement. The HOA board wasn't happy either. Word was spreading fast. Residents talking, emails flying, a few even showing up at my gate to apologize or shake my hand. One guy from 3 doors down brought me a pie. Apparently, Karen had dragged the whole neighborhood into a mess they wanted nothing to do with. By the end of the week, she had stopped leaving her house. The orange windbreaker was nowhere in sight, and her husband had started walking the dog instead. The HOA board quietly removed her name from the community bulletin. But I had a feeling she wasn't done yet. Karen never goes down without one last swing. And I was ready. Because I had one more ace in the hole she hadn't discovered yet. One that involved property lines, access roads, and a legal technicality she was about to trip over face first. But that, I figured, could wait until she tried to make her next move. I figured Karen would go quiet after the state agents dropped that little atomic truth bomb on her front lawn, but no, she doubled down. Like a poker player sitting on a pair of threes who thought she could bluff her way through a federal investigation. Just 3 days after the sheriff handed her that citation, I received a formal letter from a local attorney's office. Certified. Signed. Stamped. The whole 9 yards. According to the letter, I was being accused of causing emotional distress, community disruption, and visual degradation of the neighborhood environment. I read it 3 times just to make sure it wasn't written by a particularly dramatic high schooler. It claimed I'd intentionally placed the tractor in a provocative and hostile location, that my farming operation interfered with the peaceful residential experience, and that the community had suffered irreparable psychological harm from watching me harvest corn. The kicker? Karen was demanding I cease all future farming operations within 500 feet of the HOA boundary, citing some obscure community peace ordinance. I laughed so hard I almost fell off my porch swing. There is no community peace ordinance. That's not a real thing. That's a phrase you put in a Disney villain's manifesto, not a legal document. So I did what any rational adult would do. I took the letter to the same agricultural compliance officer from before and handed it over. He read it once, looked at me and said, "She really sent this?" I nodded. He shook his head, chuckled, and added, "This woman's playing legal Mad Libs." Then he made a phone call to the state's legal office. 36 hours later, Karen received her own letter, this one a cease and desist, citing her continued interference with protected agricultural operations, with a clear warning that any further action could result in formal charges. But the best part came at the end of the week when Karen's attorney, who clearly hadn't done any homework, walked into the local courthouse to officially file her lawsuit. And that's when things got delicious. The court clerk flagged the case and sent it directly to the regional judge assigned to infrastructure and zoning dispute. Now, here's the fun twist. I'd worked with that very judge during a land use reform task force about 5 years ago. He knows my credentials. He knows I'm not just some guy with a tractor. I'm a certified land strategist for the state with multiple zoning credits and several published papers on agricultural boundary law. Karen had just tried to sue the guy who helps write the policies she was hoping to use against me. The judge threw the case out before it even reached the docket. But he didn't stop there. He issued a formal statement advising Karen to cease any and all further legal activity until she consulted with someone who actually understood land designation law. Her attorney walked out of the building and quit on the spot. I mean, literally turned around, told her good luck, and drove off. The whole thing felt like a deleted scene from a courtroom comedy. With the legal front backfiring spectacularly, Karen turned her efforts inward. I started hearing from HOA members, people who had never spoken to me before. Turns out she'd been using HOA funds for more than just her crusade against my tractor. She'd been reimbursing herself for administrative stress, covering the tow fee out of the emergency fund, and greenlighting expenses without full board approval. One guy, Steve, who lives 2 houses down from the clubhouse, told me she even used HOA funds to install a privacy wall in her backyard, concrete, 8 feet tall, and entirely illegal by HOA standard. It didn't take long before the HOA board called an emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, obviously, but I could hear parts of it from my workshop across the field. Voices were raised, someone shouted about embezzlement, and another voice, definitely Steve's, said the words, "Call a vote." By sunset, Karen's name was removed from the HOA website. The email list changed, and a fresh flyer went out to the entire neighborhood. Special election, interim president to be appointed. I thought that would finally be the end of it, but I underestimated just how hard Karen clings to delusions of authority. One evening, a few days later, I spotted her pacing along the edge of the property line again, clipboard in hand, talking to someone on the phone, pointing at the cornfield, gesturing like she was laying siege plans. She hadn't learned a thing. Still plotting, still convinced she was right. That's when I decided it was time to reveal my final card, the one thing Karen didn't know, the thing I'd been holding onto like a golden ticket. I hadn't just leased the farmland that wrapped around her neighborhood. I had recently acquired the access road leading into the subdivision. A thin stretch of gravel, just under half a mile long, that connected the HOA's gated entrance to the county road. It had originally belonged to an old farmer who passed away. I bought the parcel through a trust when the estate went up for quiet auction. Legally, it was classified as an agricultural service road. But because the HOA didn't own the land, their right to use it existed entirely through an easement, one that required formal renewal every 5 years. The latest term had just expired, and I hadn't signed the renewal paperwork. That road? It was mine. And while I wasn't going to block it, at least not yet, I was planning something better. Something poetic. Something perfectly legal and just inconvenient enough to make Karen's teeth grind every time she left her driveway. I drove to the county office and filed a zoning request to rename the road. Since I owned it outright, and there were no objections from the surrounding landowners, it passed in under a week. I paid the small fee, chose the signage, and even had the new marker installed with the county's own maintenance crew. So now, when you drive into Karen's pristine little subdivision, you have to pass under a green sign that reads, Tractor Way. And the best part? The HOA's website had to update its community address to reflect the new road name. Every time Karen gets a delivery, a package, a pizza, or a letter from the bank, it all says Tractor Way. I haven't seen her pacing the edge of the property since. People in the neighborhood started waving when I passed. One guy stopped me to say thanks for putting her in her place. Another offered to help harvest this fall. The same HOA that once glared across the hedgerow now treated me like a folk hero. And Karen? Last I heard, she was trying to move. But good luck selling your house when your HOA just lost its president, its money, and its credibility, all because you decided to tow the wrong tractor. Just when I thought Karen had finally run out of steam, she re-emerged like a weed you missed with the tiller. Rumor had it she was trying to reclaim her HOA throne with a little public spectacle. According to Steve, the same board member who'd helped oust her, Karen had convinced the remaining loyalists on the board to host a Fall Harmony Festival. It was supposed to be the HOA's triumphant return to unity, healing, and community spirit. But everyone knew what it really was, a desperate PR stunt to distract from the flaming crater she'd left behind. And in typical Karen fashion, she had grand plans. Food trucks, hayrides, a live band, bounce houses, even a pumpkin carving contest judged by local celebrities, which, in our town, meant the guy who won last year's chili cook-off and a retired mayor's niece who once did background work in a soap commercial. It would have been hilarious if it wasn't so pitiful. But then I noticed something in the flyer Steve slipped me that made me pause. The festival was scheduled to take place at the HOA's community green, which happened to be accessible only by one road. Tractor Way. My road. My access. My terms. And they hadn't asked me a single thing. Now, legally, I couldn't just block access completely unless there was a safety concern or emergency. But I could control access points, regulate non-resident traffic, and issue a permit requirement for commercial vendors entering a private agricultural route. That's exactly what I did. I filed a use notice with the county, flagging the weekend of the festival as a restricted access window due to machinery transport and potential livestock movement. It was harvest season, after all. If I happened to be hauling a few hay bales or moving irrigation equipment that weekend, well, that was my right. 2 days before the festival, a letter went out from the county clerk's office stating that all non-residential traffic, including food vendors, entertainers, and rental companies, would need special permits to use the road. Permits which had to be requested in advance and approved by me. Not the HOA. Me. I didn't deny any. I just didn't approve them in time. Bureaucracy moves slow when you're watching a good show. The day before the festival, trucks started arriving. One tried to deliver a massive bounce house, only to be turned away by a temporary permit required for entry sign I'd installed. Another, a barbecue smoker trailer, managed to get halfway down the road before my state-registered combine pulled out of the field and parked across the path to unload. Technically, I was within my rights. The driver waited an hour before giving up and leaving. One by one, the vendors abandoned ship. Meanwhile, I was gearing up for something much better. See, I'd been planning my own little event with some friends from the state agriculture department and a few neighboring landowners. A harvest day, open to the public, complete with tractor demos, fresh kettle corn, pony rides, and a bonfire with live music from a local bluegrass band that actually knew how to play. And unlike Karen's festival, mine wasn't wedged behind layers of HOA red tape and passive-aggressive sign-up sheet. It was relaxed, welcoming, and, most importantly, fun. When Saturday hit, chaos unfolded. HOA residents arrived at the green expecting carnival rides and food truck. What they found was an empty lawn, a sagging tent, and a single bounce house half inflated by a gas generator running on fumes. Karen stood on a makeshift stage with a megaphone, trying to sound cheerful while her husband wrestled with the speaker system. Parents muttered. Kids wandered off. Someone tripped over an unplugged extension cord. The whole thing had the energy of a failed middle school fundraiser. And then they heard the music. Over the hedgerow, less than a quarter-mile away, my harvest day was in full swing. Laughter, live fiddles, the smell of smoked brisket and kettle corn drifting through the air like a scented invitation. People started drifting over, some on foot, others driving around the long way through the county road access point. I had signs out. Public welcome, family-friendly, free admission. I even had someone handing out roasted corn on the cob near the path connecting the properties. Karen must have realized what was happening because within 20 minutes she was storming toward the fence line, flanked by two board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. She shouted over the music, demanding to know how I dared poach her guest. I told her, with a smile, that my event had been on the books for weeks, was fully permitted, and open to the public. I reminded her that Tractor Way was currently flagged for agricultural use, and that it was her job to plan around that. She fumed. She threatened to call the sheriff. I pointed out the sheriff was already there, eating a turkey leg next to the band and chatting with my cousin from the fire department. One by one, the HOA families crossed the field, some not even looking back. Karen stood there, abandoned, watching her kingdom fall apart like a bouncy castle with a hole in the side. She tried to save face by joining the crowd at my event, but I had already filed a private trespass notice for her specifically, signed and stamped with state endorsement. When she tried to enter, she was politely intercepted by two off-duty deputies helping manage parking. They asked her to leave. She refused. They gave her a choice: turn around or ride in the back of the cruiser. She turned around. Later that evening, after the last spark from the bonfire had faded and the tractors were parked for the night, I sat on the porch sipping cider. From across the field, the silence from the HOA was deafening. No laughter, no music, no cars. Just one sad little pumpkin with a broken stem rolling in the wind. Steve texted me, "Best festival ever. Please do it again next year." I replied with a thumbs up and a picture of the empty bounce house left behind on the HOA lawn. Karen had tried to reclaim control with pageantry and politics, and once again, she had underestimated the quiet guy with the tractor. It wasn't just about fields and roads anymore. It was about pride. About proving that people like her couldn't stomp over boundaries just because they didn't understand them. She tried to force her way back into power with streamers and speeches. I answered with kettle corn, permits, and perfectly timed hayrides. She never stood a chance. The week after the festival, you could practically hear the silence coming from the HOA. No more flyers, no more meetings, no more Karen strutting around like she ran a small kingdom. People who used to walk by my fence line without making eye contact were now waving, smiling, even striking up small talk. I'd become the accidental hero of the neighborhood, just for standing my ground, and maybe for serving really good kettle corn. But as satisfying as that was, there was one final loose end I needed to tie up. Because while Karen had been knocked off her imaginary throne, she still lived in that house, still walked those sidewalks, and most importantly, she still believed, deep in her stubborn bones, that she could come back. So I made sure she couldn't. Remember that little access road, tractorway? The one the HOA used to enter and exit the neighborhood? Well, the easement that allowed them access had expired months ago. I hadn't renewed it, and while I hadn't blocked their entry, the legal status of the road was entirely mine to determine. Up until now, I'd let it slide. I didn't want to punish an entire neighborhood for the actions of one power-tripping lunatic. But then I learned something new. Karen had submitted an appeal to the county, trying to have the road declared a public right-of-way. Her logic was that since so many residents used it daily, it should be maintained and managed by the county. What she didn't realize was that I'd already been in contact with the county for weeks, working on a completely different plan. I filed paperwork to convert the road into a gated agricultural easement with a digital access system. In other words, no more open road. Only approved vehicles with a registered code could enter. Residents could still use it, of course, if they agreed to the access terms, which included a very specific clause. The HOA must acknowledge in writing that the road is privately owned and operated under agricultural utility status, with no jurisdiction or claim by the HOA now or in the future. And Karen? She would be permanently barred from modifying, inspecting, or influencing any access policies tied to the easement. It wasn't personal. It was surgical. The county approved it. Within 2 weeks, a small team showed up to install a gate, keypad entry system, and signage outlining the access rules. The new sign stood tall just before the gate. Private agricultural road, entry by permit only. The HOA board received the access agreement. Most of them signed it within days. Steve even came by to thank me for how generously worded it was, considering everything that had gone down. But Karen? She refused. Not only did she refuse, she wrote a lengthy email to the board accusing me of infrastructure bullying, whatever that means. She claimed I was holding the neighborhood hostage, using the road as leverage to punish her. Which, to be fair, was only partly true. I wasn't holding them hostage. I gave them a clear, legal path forward. But Karen was holding herself hostage, chained to her own pride. When the gate officially activated, her refusal had consequences. Without a valid entry code, she couldn't use the main road. She had to take the long way out of the neighborhood, an extra 20 minutes down a bumpy gravel path that skirted a creek and passed through an old ranch trail. It was technically public, but barely maintained and full of potholes. The rest of the neighborhood drove through the gate just fine. But Karen? She bounced and rattled and cursed her way out of the subdivision every day like she was stuck in a cartoon loop of her own making. Then came the mailbox. Because of the address change from the road renaming, all HOA residents had to update their mailing addresses to reflect the new name, Tractor Way. The post office required it. Insurance companies required it. Everyone adjusted, everyone moved on. Everyone except Karen. She fought the change like it was the hill she planned to die on. She sent letters to the county, filed a complaint with the postmaster, even wrote an op-ed for the local paper that never got published, ranting about how the name was undignified for a community of professionals. I decided to give her a going-away gift. I purchased a custom mailbox from a local metal artist. It was hand-welded into the shape of a miniature tractor, complete with wheels and a working red flag that popped up when the mail arrived. I installed it at the entrance of the private road, right next to the gate, under a little wooden sign that read, Tractor Way Mail Stop Deliveries for Residents Only. The mail carrier loved it. Said it was the most creative mailbox they'd seen all year. HOA residents smiled every time they drove by. Kids pointed it out to their parents. Even people from other neighborhoods came by to take photos with it. Karen had to pick up her mail from a mailbox shaped like the very thing she tried to remove from her life. It was poetic. Eventually, her house went up for sale. Quietly. No open houses. No tours. Just a simple online listing with bland photos and a note that read, "Private showings available upon request." Steve told me she was moving across town to a condo. Something with no land, no tractors, no roads she couldn't control. The listing sat for weeks before it finally went under contract. I heard she took a loss. Not surprising, considering the reputation she'd built. The day the moving truck came, I stood on my porch, sipping lemonade, watching her pack the last of her things. She didn't look over once. Not at me, not at the fields, not even at the mailbox. She climbed into the passenger seat of her SUV and didn't glance back. It was the quietest I'd ever seen her. When the truck turned down the private road, the gate opened automatically, as it did for approved vehicles. The movers had followed the access agreement, submitted their paperwork, received a code. They were respectful, professional. Karen? She had to follow behind, waiting for the gate to close and reopen. She never signed. Never would. And so, as the gate slowly creaked shut behind her for the final time, she rolled to a stop, just on the edge of the exit, looking back through the gate at a field full of sunflowers starting to bloom. Then she drove away. And that was that. The neighborhood returned to normal. The board elected Steve as the new president. They hosted a potluck to thank me for my patience, and someone brought a cake shaped like a tractor. No joke. It was chocolate with green frosting and little licorice wheels. We laughed. We shared stories. Nobody mentioned Karen. That night, I walked out to the field, leaned on the fence, and looked at the stars. The wind rustled the crops, and off in the distance, the gate stood still, guarding the path she no longer owned. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need lawsuits or shouting matches. All I needed was the truth, some patience, and a road named after the very thing she tried to erase. And in the end, that road led her straight out of town.